Thanks, Chris. Thank you. So we were trying to figure out the best way I'm going to sit, I think, and make it cozy and informal, hopefully. I'm really honored to be here. Chris called me and set this up. It was just really nice of him to do that. And welcome to everybody streaming. I have a talk tonight. I'm going to read it. I'm not do it extemporaneously. Hopefully I'll look up enough at you and not make it too boring. But it's a combinations of things I've written before in a different way and some new things. It's called Reawakening the Imagination in the Age of Biomedicine, Psychological Fallacy. Hopefully that's the most intellectual of statements I'll make. I'm probably preaching to the choir when I talk to everybody here about this tonight, but it's a fun thing to think about as things have become so skewed biomedically, especially at least in the field I am in psychiatry. And so here we go. So let's start out with Akira Kurosawa, the great Japanese director, when he says, "To be an artist means never to avert one's eyes." I like to hang out at Esther Short Park. It's right across the street from my Vancouver apartment, where I stay when I'm in town working. It's an interesting juxtaposition of condos and a fancy Hilton hotel, upscale apartments and street corner restaurants, punctuated with the omnipresent Starbucks. And all throughout this picture of Norman Rockwell white Vancouver privilege, the homeless, sitting huddled in the corners of Starbucks, trying to dry out from another rainy night, sleeping on one of the park's many benches or in the large gazebo used in the summer for music concerts. Shopping carts overflowing with their meager possessions, haggard faces and carried teeth, torn and unwashed clothes, many talking to themselves, holding animated conversation with some inner or maybe outer torturous ghost. It was from these experiences from which we often turn away, that Jung said could really teach us about life and the how of becoming a therapist. To quote Jung, "Anyone who wants to know the human psyche will learn next to nothing from experimental psychology. She would be better advised to abandon exact science, put away his scholar's gown, bid farewell to her study, and wander with human heart through the world. There, in the horrors of prisons, lunatic asylums, and hospitals, in drab suburban pubs, in brothels and gambling hells, in the salons of the elegant, the stock exchanges, socialist meetings, churches, revivalist gatherings, and ecstatic sects." That's S-E-C-T-S, not E-X. "Through love and hate, through the experience of passion in every form in her body, he would reap richer stores of knowledge than textbooks a foot thick could give her. And she will know how to doctor the sick with a real knowledge of the human soul." I've watched the field of both psychiatry and psychology move further away in their theoretical stances from the centrality of dreams, the importance of body, the necessity of story and imagination, and especially away from more creative ways of dealing with extreme and altered states of consciousness than the biological. The question could be asked, how did psychiatry fall asleep to alternative views on psychosis, medication, side effects, therapy, commitment laws, and other crucial topics? My goal in penning While Psychiatry Slept was to point out, with tongue-in-cheek, how in its somnambulism, psychiatry has forgotten that dreams were once the royal road. We now know that the dreaming, as the Australian Aboriginals have called it, is occurring all the time and arises in the conduits of the soul's choosing. dreams of the night, symptoms in the body, the waking dreams of psychosis and hallucinations and delusions, relationship issues, and synchronicities with the environment. But a critical thinker in an audience tonight, one of you might be thinking, why are dreams so crucial to psychiatry? And I would tell you that they are the forgotten language of the psyche. They are the native tongue of the middle world. And this dialect is composed of metaphor and symbol, simile, and synecdoche. All who enter the world of non-consensus reality, or what psychiatry calls psychosis, long for a healer with a therapeutic ear, trained to hear the patois of image. For as Jung emphatically stated, image is psyche. It is only from here that we as therapists can track the deepest longings and movements of our client's psychic reality. I would like to explore tonight how I believe returning to dreams to their once central position in psychiatric theory can revitalize a field whose defining ideas have become completely positivistic in their imaginings. I thought a good place to start this exploration of the dream world would be with a section from my book's introduction on the etymology of the word mad. When I was in the midst of writing the book, I struggled mightily with a case of writer's block, and it was then that I had this dream. Dr. Young was with me while in his later years, moving slowly, yet clearly quite vibrant. Young and I began to speak about what the problem had been with my writing and what was holding me back. I talked about my work hours, but said these had improved and were no longer an issue. I told him that I was sure it was my ongoing struggle with being disciplined, but to my surprise, he did not agree. He suddenly turned and faced me and with an impish grin said, "You must write from your madness," as I did. He seemed to do a little jig, and I got stopped by one of my favorite people coming in. He seemed to do a little jig and then added, "How do you think I wrote so many books?" What does Jung mean that he wrote from his madness? And what does it mean to write from mine? Does it symbolize writing from your deepest passions and beliefs, from where you feel the anger that something is terribly wrong? Could the roots of the word madness give us a hint to the answer? Mad meaning Gamaida, or out of one's mind, implying outside the typical collective views, seeming to be foolish and stupid. It comes from Gamoida and the Latin mutare, meaning to change. Mad bursts also from migrare, the changing of one's residence. An interpretation might be imagined to read, writing from our foolish self, the one that seems stupid and not agreed upon by normal views, leads to a possible change in direction from the current consensus ideas and theories. It opens us to the ability to change where we are sitting in our resident beliefs and see the world from different vantage points. It may take a touch of madness to do this. So I'm asking you tonight to grant me this foolishness and have an open mind about my attempt at bringing dreams back to their rightful place, the centerpiece of all psychological theory. It is from here that the original meaning of psychotherapy is remembered, therapy of the soul. So the first mad step to take here is to question some of the recent science coming out of the American Journal of Psychiatry in May of 2017, titled "The Long-Term Effects of Antipsychotic Medication on the Clinical Course of Schizophrenia." In this paper by Goff et al., 8 authors of international fame conclude that questions about the safety of antipsychotics for first-break psychosis and long-term maintenance are spurious in their conclusions, and their rigorous meta-analysis of the literature proves otherwise. In fact, Jeffrey Lieberman, MD, one of the principal authors and former head of the American Psychiatric Association and Kolb Professor of Psychiatry at Columbia University, said, quote, "This was an evidence-based review of the literature and concluded that there is no compelling evidence that supports these concerns, either in immediate treatment or in long-term maintenance. In the subsequent press release and video for a Medscape commentary, Lieberman has touted it as proving that antipsychotics provide a great benefit, psychiatry's protocols are just fine, and that critics are nefarious individuals intent on doing harm. Robert Whitaker, Philip Hickey, Joanna Moncrief, and Miriam Larson-Barr have all written excellent rebuttals to Goff's paper on the Mad in America website, and I encourage those of you interested to read these. I'm going to go in a different direction. In fact, I would like instead to question this paper from another direction and represent the stance of the well-documented psychological literature that Goff et al., along with Nasir Ghami, the Tufts University professor of psychiatry, ignore. Ghami states in his paper titled The Psychological Fallacy in Psychiatry in Psychology Today, August of 2013. He says, quote, "How many times has a patient told me when I ask about depressive or manic symptoms, yes, but I was depressed because of X, Y, and Z, or I get manic when I get really interested in things. How many times have I seen mental health clinicians downplay a mood illness diagnosis because they were associated with many psychosocial stressors? These psychological judgments are basically made based on common sense. But if common sense were enough to explain things, then our patients would have convinced themselves or been convinced by their friends and family. If a patient crosses the threshold of a clinician's door, then common sense has failed. No need to keep using it. What is needed is scientific sense, which is quite different than common sense. In fact, there is a far deeper fallacy than the oft-repeated claim of biological reductionism. There is no worse risk for psychology and psychiatry than the psychological fallacy. So there's our gauntlet, okay? See if we can run through that. Let's look at what these researchers coming from a strictly biological position have seemed to eschew. There are many verified therapeutic successes, some dating back to at least 4000 BC, when a suicidal Egyptian man held hallucinatory conversations with his Ba soul, known as the dialogue of the world-weary man with his Ba, and documented in Barbara Hanna's book, Encounters with the Soul. These reports have continued down through the centuries, with John Percival's recovery from his 1830 psychotic break reported in Gregory Bateson's wonderful book, Percival's Narrative, and Anton Boisson's amazing story in his exploration of the inner world. We also have Harry Stack Sullivan documented successes with his method of interpersonal psychotherapy, along with Carl Menninger's famous quote of his patients who had experienced a psychotic episode, often becoming weller than well. One of my favorite comments about psychosis is from Jung, who had remarkable success with psychotic patients throughout his long career, when he said in his 1922 book, The Psychogenesis of Mental Illness, that, quote, "modern psychiatry behaves like someone who thinks he can decipher the meaning and purpose of a building by a mineralogical analysis of its stones." He then added statistics from that time showing it was rare in any case of schizophrenia, no matter how chronic, to find anatomical brain changes on autopsy. In his opinion, this proved that the purely anatomical approach of psychiatry does not lead adequately to the questions of understanding the psychic disturbance. The way to a psychiatry of the future, which would need to come to grips with the essence of matter, was clearly therefore marked out. It could only be by way of psychology. This dogma, he finished saying, can only lead to an absolute sterility of thought and research as soon as it is assumed to be generally valid. This belief in psychosocial approaches can be seen in the work championed by Kazimierz Dabrowski in his theory of positive disintegration, and also Freedom from Reichman, the psychiatrist from I've Never Promised You a Rose Garden fame, and later by Lauren Mosher at Soteria House, John Perry at Diabasis, and R.D. Lang at Kingsley Hall in London. It is now being followed up by a plethora of therapists from all over the world, many involved in the Hearing Voices movement and the International Society for the Psychosocial Treatment of Psychoses. These would include, but are not limited to, Bertram Karin, Brian Martindale, David Garfield, Iris Steinem, Wayo Yalanen, Johan Kohlberg, Richard Bentel, David Downing, Marilyn Case, Marilyn Charles, Tracy Morgan, and Murray Jackson. When Goff, Lieberman, and Gami can leave some of the greatest minds in the field from both past and present out of the discussion, claiming that antipsychotic medications are always the best treatment for psychosis, and that approaching psychosis psychologically is a logical fallacy, then I would state that these arguments don't show a scientific candor, but instead border on disrespect and the most egregious fallacy in any civil debate, an ad hominem position. Take a sip of water here. Let's switch gears. And let me tell you about the last time I was with John Perry, one of the great thinkers on psychosis in the 20th century. John had come to my home to stay the night before we drove down to a conference focused on treating psychosis without medication and with psychotherapeutic approaches. We were both presenters along with Joe Goodbread at a conference that Arnie had set up on the coast to work on these issues. That was back in, it's like 1994, I think, maybe, some time ago. We were looking at both Jungian process work ideas that might be helpful in this area. Arnie had written a book on the topic titled City Shadows, where he had outlined practical and useful methods for working with psychotic states. That's still an incredibly good book. I was asked to give the opening lecture to the conference and was still struggling that evening to get the first words on paper. At that time in my life, I was also studying for the psychiatric boards, and I'd been reading the section on psychosis out of what was considered the Bible of psychiatric information, Friedman, Kaplan, and Sadok's comprehensive textbook of psychiatry. I had awakened anxiously that night before John arrived with this dream. I'm back at the Milwaukee County Mental Health Center, where I had worked for many years post-residency. I called the medical director about an escaped chronic psychotic patient who was planning to murder me. He's finally caught and brought to talk to me, a huge man slumped over with arms that droop and hang down ape-like. He tells me his name is Alden. He looks absolutely enraged with me, saying that I've been reading the wrong books. He pulls out a book and says, "This is my Bible. It is a separate reality," Carlos Castaneda's book about Don Juan, the Mexican shaman. I tell him I've read it, but he comments sarcastically, "Apparently not very well." He begins showing me a page from the book with 8 principles on it when I awake. John and I sat up late that night talking about the hoped-for paper and also about my meeting with Alden. He felt that a visitation by an unknown man in the dream was very important and related somehow to the conference. He also thought that even though most dreams are personal, this dream was making a comment about ways of looking and working with psychotic or extreme states of reality. Alden, he kept saying over and over again. Then suddenly, with a look of apparent discovery, said, "Say it very fast. Go ahead and say, Alden. My other half, Alden. Say it very fast and keep repeating it." I began repeating the name quicker and quicker, one on top of the next, until suddenly It began to sound like my other half. Yes, that's it, said John. Alda half is your other half. A deeper wisdom than your everyday ego identity. Jung might call him an image of the self, and he clearly lives in another world, separate from our everyday reality, with its own rules, what Jung called the collective unconscious. I would write your paper from that point of view, wondering what Al might say those 8 principles are. John, that's a great idea, I responded, clearly excited. I don't think that Alda half is meaning techniques, though, but I imagine that he was most concerned about the background attitudes and feelings we bring to our work, what Amy and Arnie have called meta skills. Techniques and methods only become useful after the crucial background beliefs and attitudes are brought to awareness. I agree, John quickly replied. I'm heading off to bed so as to let you get to your writing. This sounds just right. John headed upstairs to his room, and I stayed up most of the night imagining what Al would have said. Here are a few of those 8 principles written back in 1994, but still as cogent today when working with extreme states of consciousness. 1. Hercules' sword be damned. There are many stories of Hercules' adventures, but for the purposes of this paper, I would like to focus on his journey to Hades. As he drops down into the underworld, he finds it hazy, his vision fogged, moonlight and mist, nothing clear, certainly not his preferred bright and intelligible light of the sun. As he tries to acclimate to this new and unfamiliar world, 2 shades, ghosts of the dead, approach him. In a flash, Hercules draws his sword and beheads them. No questions, no sense of what they wanted, no relationship. Hercules responds exactly as one would expect if he had been trained in our current schools of psychotherapy. The heroic ego is still our ideal, capturing new ground from the id, making knowing interpretations and usurping more power and mastery for itself. The schools are all grounded in psychotherapeutic techniques aimed at getting rid of the ghosts, symptoms, that approach us before allowing them any voice of their own. But even though this may appear to work in the day world of neurosis, the world of psychosis is much different. It is bathed in moonlight, and the separations of good and bad, black and white, are not so distinct. Here, lack of clarity and being open to what Keats has called negative capability is the key. The ability to sit in confusion and not reach for the dividing sword of intellect and explanation so quickly. To be open to what Mindell calls deep democracy. This allows for the realization that you are not the only ruler of your psychic house, and that all the inner figures deserve a voice. Number 2, panic can be the deadliest enemy. We can see from this last story that panic leads to Hercules' precipitous reaction towards the shades. Panic is an extreme affective reaction brought on by the sympathetic nervous system, responding to an overwhelming fear of the unknown. But what if Hercules could have been with someone encouraging a more understanding attitude toward the contents arising from the unconscious? Jung comments on this same idea in his introduction to John Perry's book, The Self and Psychotic Process, when he says, quote, "One should not underestimate or underrate the disastrous shock which patients undergo when they find themselves assailed by the intrusion of strange contents which they are unable to integrate. The mere fact that they have such ideas isolates them from their fellow women and men and exposes them to irresistible panic, which often marks the outbreak of manifest psychosis. If, on the other hand, they meet with adequate understanding from their physician, they do not fall into panic because they are still understood by a human being and thus preserve the disastrous shock of complete isolation." In R.D. Laing's book, The Politics of Experience, he wrote a chapter called The 10-Day Voyage. In it, the patient was asked what would have made a difference in his treatment, And he responded, a sheet anchor, the feeling that someone understood. These ideas of Lang's and Jung's were well tested in the 1970s in facilities such as Diabasis and Soteria House, hospitalization alternative treatment facilities for people in psychotic states. When helpers met with acute psychotic experiences, the shades of Hercules, with an attitude of openness and validation, they found that patients often came through these extreme states more rapidly than similar patients treated in more classic psychiatric hospital wards. Number 3, random firing neurons do not exist. I took this comment from Sir Francis Crick, winner of the Nobel Prize for discovering the structure of DNA with James Watson, and who later went on to become a dream researcher after his DNA fame. He implied that dreams were random neuron firings with a purely biological purpose. This theory, when applied, would make it very hard to validate a person's dreaming experience as psychologically meaningful. Armed with this attitude, psychiatrists can easily compare psychosis to chronic physical illnesses caused by biochemical abnormalities and genetic predispositions. However, no matter how useful the biological theory has been for science and somatic medicine, and no matter what a patient's genetic and medical history, they always have a psychology. That means that no matter how difficult to understand, the images and symbols that are arising still form a possible communication system. I believe in the irreducibility of a person's psychology. This belief allows us to continue to look for new ways to work and communicate with patients in extreme states of consciousness, no matter what the prevailing biological theories. The idea that a patient's attitude could affect the long-range outcome of their psychosis was shown in research by Soskis and Bowers. They found that patients who were interested in how to make sense of their psychotic experience had a much lower rate of recidivism than did clients who considered the experiences as nothing but a part of a biochemical illness. These are just a few of out of half's imagined recommendations. I continue to believe that these are useful and crucial today as they were when John and I worked on this dream over 20 years ago. In reworking this lecture for my book, I finished by saying this: nihilo tamen initium, ending yet beginning. How could this be that so much of what is laid out in this work is still not agreed upon or considered generally accepted knowledge in the field? I believe that we have been lulled to sleep by the biochemical model. As Jung said, it has led to a sterility of thought. There is a dearth of funded research that offers exploration of psychotherapy for the psychosis, though the investigations out of Finland involving the need-adapted model and the immensely successful open dialogue programs, along with NIMH's RAISE studies in the United States, are at least beginning to move the pendulum. This new wave of psychosocial treatments is encouraging, especially with the advent of the Hearing Voices movement and the excitement and worldwide growth of the International Society for Psychological and Social Approaches to Psychosis. However, no matter that these important and necessary moves help us move away from the devastating beliefs of the age of the brain era of the 1990s, led by the bias of PRA May studies that denigrated milieu therapy for schizophrenia, it still does not go far enough in recognizing psychosis as an attempt by the psyche to heal itself. The most important message I take from Out of Half is the crucial realization that his world is a separate reality and requires a radical change of imagination if we are to truly understand the patients that have entered this foreign land with him. Until psychiatric hospitals and their treatment units move back in time towards therapeutic milieus, longer stays, less medication, and validating the environment as affecting the outcome of the process, until psychiatrists receive training in metaphor and symbol, finalistic causality, and the idea that the psyche is capable of destroying itself to bring forth something new and possibly better, then we psychiatrists will stay enamored by quick medication interventions. We will continue gluing the pieces of Humpty Dumpty back together again into his old self, rather than realizing that the psyche was attempting all along to reimagine the person into their higher and truer self. There she was, sitting in front of me at my office, tense and tearful, seated right on the edge of my wooden rocker, the same one that she had occupied so comfortably just a short week before. It was Marnie. I had worked with her for over a year, making wonderful headway in a difficult psychotic process. Now she had come in for an emergency session, as psychotic thoughts and fears had returned over the weekend when she and her husband had been away on a vacation at a mountain resort community, when she began getting extremely anxious while at the grocery store. It was as if everyone were looking at her and talking about her. Marnie began to avoid shopping and had her husband go instead. She also didn't want to go out to dinner or do any of the social activities they typically loved when on vacation. She began to notice when walking her dog that she heard gunshots and was sure somebody was shooting at her. After hearing the gunshots, she began to stay in her bedroom and not leave the house. Her husband called me for an emergency session. I saw her the next day. We talked about taking these events as if they were dreams and metaphorical imaginings, now alive in the world. She had always had a good relationship with me, and we had worked this way earlier in her treatment, but she said it felt so real and actual, and that she was sure these incidents couldn't be metaphorical. She was being shot at. She and I had always worked following Jung's dictum of not out, but through. Though still sure this was real, she agreed to explore both events as dreams. Going first into the avoidance of shopping, we set up a mini play in my office. I had her follow the traces and sensations of her body experiences she had felt while shopping and begin to fill out the character or figure that was trying to arise more precisely. She hunched her shoulders and pulled down into her sweater. She averted her face and wanted to turn away. I had her feel into this character and make an image other than herself of this person. I told her it could be a movie star, a fairy tale figure, a person she knew. She said it looked like a woman that might be homeless, with poorly kept hair and tattered clothes and holes in her shoes. I had her stand and imagine moving like this woman, and as she did, she became hunched over, and words came out that said something like, "I'm sorry for being here. I'm ashamed. You're all so much better. This is not my place." Marnie was surprised at the depth of these feelings. I said she seemed to be talking to someone, as if apologizing to some other character in the drama. She said it was all the well-to-do people there. This mountain resort was for the rich, and she just didn't belong there. I noted to her I'd never heard her feel this way about her vacation location before. I asked if anything had happened recently. Suddenly, she remembered that she had been with her mother and some other woman, and Marnie had been talking about going to the resort for the weekend when her mother's friend said, "Oh, that's so expensive." Her mother apparently chimed in that Marnie and her husband had decided to not live as modestly as she and her friend had done. This left Marnie quite embarrassed. I asked her how she felt. She said, "I was angry, but didn't say anything. It's just like my mother. She takes pot shots at me all the time." I was just right, just on cue. Good job. Marnie was completely unaware that she had spontaneously interpreted the reason and meaning of her hallucinations. I said slowly, "Oh, she takes pot shots at you? You mean she sometimes shoots at you with jabs and barbs?" She got it immediately and was able to come back and see that these incidents at the resort were connected, like having two dreams back to back in the same night. This was a breakthrough in therapy because she was able to see and connect her waking, paranoid, and hallucinatory experiences to her everyday life and to her previous dreams. Marnie has recovered completely and has not had any further psychotic experience since these events. So this is a brief taste of my book. It involves fictional stories from working with patients over my 40-year career in psychiatry, exploring the ways the soul can arise from body to synchronicity, from countertransference to tonight's concentration on extreme states. And lastly, on emphasizing in this age of evidence-based medicine, we as therapists must steel ourselves against the absurd argument of a psychological fallacy. And that may be what dreams are doing for us, is fictionalizing our history, creating healing fictions, and pulling us more deeply into what the great writer Graham Greene calls the compost heap of history, where literal memories come out not as journalism and purported fact, but altered into the deeper truth of imagination. Now therapy becomes art, for it is no longer looking for the literal scientific truth, but instead reshapes the literal truth of the world into forms that reveal the deeper, universal truths of our existence. This is what I call the making of soul. Thank you. Wow. Who knew your mouth gets so dry as you do that? Wow. Oh, thank you. Yeah, so questions, answers. There's lots of stuff.
Well, I have a lot of questions, but if folks have a question, if they don't mind speaking into this, it's not so much for our group, it's for the folks online, so they can hear. But I was just wondering how something you said early on is that dreams communicate to us through images, and imagery is primary to the psyche.
Mm-hmm. Image is psyche.
Image is psyche,
Mm-hmm.
and I just wondered if you could elaborate on. I loved that thought. I just was trying to think that through. Yeah.
From Jung's perspective, the psyche is mythopoetic. It's creating story and fantasy every day, and it does that through images. Now, I think in Jung's time, image for him was very visual, though in his 1916 paper, he really expanded and talked about visual types and auditory types and body types. Certainly, Arnie, amazing work of expanding out the channels. And so when I think of imagery nowadays, I think it more like Khalil Gibran and William Blake talk about image, where they talk about image more as it can come up from body or it can be auditory. And so I see it more that way. Jung specifically was saying that the image that comes out is the play of psyche, the play of the soul. And he has a wonderful thing in his Confrontation with the Unconscious, the chapter where he, for the first time, is really going in and becoming the Jung that we know as Jung. Prior to that, he really was a kind of a Freudian to some degree. But after his confrontation with the unconscious, and in that he would say that whenever he could find the image in the crevices of the affect, and when he could find the images in the affect, he was relieved. He now could start to be in relationship. And I think that's what's so important in this day, especially in psychiatry and DSM and everything else, where everything becomes abstractions. I have anxiety, I have psychosis, I have schizophrenia, I have borderline, I have this and that. They're all abstractions. You can't have a relationship with that. You can only start to have a relationship once it becomes figural. Once it becomes an image, once it becomes a figure with its own voice. Hillman has a wonderful saying now that I just love, which is said, less of what the figures mean, more about what they want. You know, and then you can be in relationship. So,
thank you.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah. Other thoughts, questions? I'm not dissing biochemistry. Please don't anybody leave here tonight with that. It just should be one of the pieces and not the only piece. There's a tendency right now, at least in psychiatry, to make it the only piece.
Hi, George.
Amy.
It's great to see you.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Oh.
So many thoughts go through my head. One is just, I love your book.
Oh,
and I also just have to say, I love your way of writing, and it's so poetic and beautiful. Like, I feel like your words mirror what you're talking about, or it really brings it through the words, brings what you're saying to life. It's just very beautiful.
Oh,
So
thanks,
I
Amy.
that.
Thanks
I've
so
always
much.
loved your writing.
Yeah.
And I'm just wondering, because you were saying you're not dissing biomedical stuff and all of that, and but in another way, you're sort of making a revolution, or it seems to me like really wanting to change how all of us think about these things and psychosis and everything. And I wonder how it's been for you, either since your book came out, or I don't know how long you're talking about these ideas. It is for you.
There's some people here that have been in classes with me at the place I used to work, and I always got wonderful feedback from them that thinking more imaginatively and was a place that gave them heart and passion. And again, this is my place that I've got. I think the field of psychiatry, which is a huge field and encompasses treating so many things and lots of wonderful things, but in the psychiatry aspect itself, where psychiatrists have no training in dreams whatsoever, no matter where they go to school, no matter what residency program in the country, there's no training in dreams. If there's going to be psychodynamic theory, it's going to be Freudian. There won't be any mention of Jung. There's certainly no mention of process work. There's no imagination about the body. When you work as a psychiatrist or a nurse practitioner, they're paying you just to see people, do evaluations, and give them medications. And if you see psychology students, the vast majority of them are trained only in cognitive behavioral therapy. So there's there's so much that here's the thing I would say with this. It's not that Gami or Jeffrey Lieberman don't have things to offer. I've seen people with medication come out of states. I've seen terrible things happen in psychotic states. I've seen people's lives go. There's so many things. It's not that they're bad people. It's not that they're not helping people. It's not that medications for some people can be a great thing. However, if you're just talking about, well, this is science, okay? My complaint with that is that can you know, if you think about the definition of science from Popper, which is conjecture and refutation, really? That's one of the considered the standards of it. Can you really always conjecture and refute what you're seeing in science if you're so focused that you're not letting in any other data? So in the first paper in my book, I talk about this schizophrenic patient I'm working with, this amazing, lovely woman. And as she's talking, there's this blue jay hitting the window over and over and over and over again. And my office at that time was out in a field with no trees. What the hell's a blue jay doing there, you know, in the first place? And why does it keep banging at the window? And she blanches as this happened because she was just talking to me. Part of her whole thing was never having relationships with a man, and she had to give her life to God and all great stuff, but she had split off a whole side of herself. Well, she had turned out to give herself to somebody recently, and she thought she might be pregnant. And she had said to me, if I'm pregnant, I'm going to keep the baby. And just as she said that, this blue jay hit the window, and then hit the window, and then hit the window, and then hit the window. And her face blanched. And I said, what do you know about blue jays? And she says, they steal the eggs from the nest and eat them. Just as she said she might be pregnant and keep the baby. And I said, what happened in your thoughts? Just at that time, she said, I heard a voice that said I was evil for being pregnant. Now, the point I'm making with this is if I'm making Gami the straw dog here for a second, or straw man, okay? If Gami was there, Gami's not open to that data. So you can't, I'm saying you can't just say that psychosis is only this if you're not open to other data, if you're not open to dreams, if you're not open to synchronicity, if you're not open to a body thing to keep in the pot of things to consider, then I say that's not really scientific. That's my biggest complaint about it, that there's data that's there, that it's not that you then throw out that, you just start to have to include it. Is that? Yeah.
That was that and more. That's
Yeah.
great. I just love hearing that. It's very inspiring.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that's what, with all the patients, you know, and people coming in, if you're just open, you know, if you're just open to more of the things, it becomes, I think it becomes an amazing, thing. You're constantly surprised, you know? Yeah. Well, the whole psychoanalytic thing went too far. I mean, they had couches in hospitals, and, you know, it didn't make any difference who and what you were, what was going on. You know, you were doing, 4 times a week on the couch psychoanalysis, and so the advent of so many other things, the inventor of cognitive behavioral therapy was a Boston analyst, Freudian analyst. And then you have the incredible stuff of Mnuchin and Haley coming out of the family work. So there had to be a shift. But I think, what did I say with Keats? Can you sit with negative capability? Most people going to medical school want to have an answer and want to say what it is and reach for it. And with that age of the brain and being able to say, oh, it's the amygdala or the hypothalamus that causes this. And it gives people, it binds your anxiety, and it's hard to sit with anxiety. And I think sitting with dreams, you have to sit with that. You have to sit with that more. I also think that dreams got such a bad name to some degree because everything became wish fulfillment and interpretations, and you really wanted to do this with your mom or your dad, or it had to do with your anal problems. Everything got in a direction that way, and it didn't totally make sense. It didn't, and still to this degree, still to this day, I mean, if I'm teaching a class and I talk about teleology or finalistic causality or the idea that something's moving towards the future, that is still completely not taught. That's just not taught. So, you know, from a standpoint of working with dreams and thinking that way, where you're thinking more about like process work thinks and good Jungian analysts think, bringing the figure out, talking to it, seeing where it's going, noticing it, then I think dreaming becomes less imprecise, or you can start to track it more.
Thank you.
I think always with the signals, you know, somebody who maybe is so anxious or something, if you can give them, sometimes you give them something you might give an interpretation or give a thing and they give the feedback like, that's relaxing. And that's a good move, as long as I'm remembering as I do that I just made that move heuristically, you know, usefully, but I don't really believe it. As long as I can keep that imaginal thing like, okay, I made the move here, that's the best move, but that doesn't mean that's where it stops. That just may mean the move I had to make now. But
a next step, not an answer.
yes, yeah, yeah. And if I can stay imaginal with that and stay knowing that, then when the proper time comes or the person's open to it, I tell a story in the book, again, it's Marnie, where we had done a lot of work for a long time, and I was working a little more interpretively than I do now in actuality. And I suddenly, there's a great saying from Jung, when Jung first entered into his unconscious, and he said, I treated the figures of my unconscious as if they were real and listened attentively to what they said. That was his mantra, okay? The psychic reality of it. I treated them as if they were real and listened attentively to what they said. So I was doing this treatment and working, and suddenly I realized we weren't doing that. I wasn't treating this figure of the smuggler that kept coming up as if she were real and listened to attentively. And we switched gears and we started to just really bring out the smuggler, you know, like all of you do in process work. You know, you make a puppet, you do a thing, you do, you know, and we started to, and suddenly this figure, the story of the bowl cut girl came out, and this amazing thing. She talked about what she wanted. And, you know, we often think, oh, the edge figure is a parent or this or that. That's true. But in this instance, she was really mad at the client. You're not listening to me. You're never listening to what I want. You're never listening. I want to do this and that. And we started to not interpret her, but just, you know, what did she have to say? What did she want? It completely changed the therapy. It just completely changed the therapy. It was, and I started realizing that more and more. I had a person the other day have this huge amount of fight with his wife, but then all this stuff came up and memories from his past and a horribly abusive stepfather, just the kind of stuff that we hear that you barely can stand. But what we did differently is I said, and we worked, oh, he's coming back up to talk to you with that memory. He's coming up to have you remember him. And we worked from the memory and the anxiety and all that was coming as if it were the figure that was bringing it, and to be in relationship to that figure. And that was very different than me interpreting it or having him focus on his anger or You see what that's the way I'm trying to do that more. Yeah. Just last fall, the International Society conference in the US was held in Portland for the treatment of psychosocial treatment of psychosis. And that's becoming huge worldwide, just huge. And so I think that's really, to some degree, the only reason that NIMH came up with the RAISE program is that Finland was so far ahead of us in their treatment of psychosis, it became embarrassing. This is a true story. It's a little weird. It's almost, there's a town in Finland that was using the open dialogue method, and there's a thing called duration of untreated psychosis. It's DUP. And the biomedical people want to say, well, DUP has to do as soon as you can get somebody on an antipsychotic. What's the duration between the person having an episode and getting on an antipsychotic? But the literature actually shows it's the duration between when they start to have an episode and they start to have contact and relationship and be able to talk about it. This little town in Finland, they, with the open dialogue method and getting all the information out and teaching people and everything in the schools and everything else, they were able to lower the duration of untreated psychosis, the DUP, so much so that they closed all their inpatient psychiatric wards because the people were responding, because they were getting the treatment. So there is a lot of exciting things happening. It always is slow. There's a saying by Hillman that the literal is death to the soul. It's like telling the story, you know, you're telling the story of two people sitting on the park bench waiting for a bus, and one of them's let's say a Wall Street broker whose car broken down and had to take the bus that day, and another is a homeless person who's having a psychotic break, and the Wall Street guy's on the phone, the quote real phone, talking to a friend saying, Jesus, this guy over here is crazy. He's talking to himself and nuts. And the psychotic person's talking on a fake phone saying, this guy here thinks everything's about Wall Street. What a nut. But there's nobody in the middle, right? There's nobody in the imaginal. Both of them are really psychotic, right? And so this idea, when you start to see through things and hear through things metaphorically and imaginally, what happens when somebody is in psychosis is that Marnie used to come in and she used to say, my dreams are alive in the world. That's what she would say to me. We had lots of experiences that way. My dreams are alive in the world. And the idea was to help her connect to those in a more dreaming kind of way, connect to the dreaming. And when that can happen, there's like a bridge that the person can walk back from the one world into the other world. They have a bridge. Am I answering that okay? Yeah. So I tell a story in the book about Julia, and she comes into a session and she stands up and she's raging at me about how I don't take care of my plant, my jade plant, just raging at me. And I'm just out to lunch at first. I'm like, holy crap, what am I gonna do? You know, I had no idea what to do. And then I got it, you know, I was slow on the uptake, but I go, oh, the plant's a symbol, you know, it's a metaphor here. So I went over to the plant with her, and she was telling how it wasn't watered right and the little shoots need to be cared for and nobody thinks and as we went into that, and I asked her, gave her my arm to show me, you know, if this was a little shoot, what did it need? And she started to touch my arm and give it love like that. And then alls I did was change and touched her arm. And I said, you mean like your father never did? And just for a little while, for the rest of that session, there was no psychosis. That had made a bridge. Arnie would call that the up periscope technique. I went down into that world with her. I'll never